Welcome back to the show. We're taking your calls from the Hard Question Hotline. If you would like to leave us your question, we encourage you to call 412-349-4326. I know you got questions out there. Write them down while the show's going on, and then call that number afterwards and leave us your questions. We'd love to answer your question on the air. Let's go to our next one.
Yes, I want to know, is illegal immigration a sin? If I come into a country illegally, is it a sin? And also, as Christians, what is our stance to be on illegal immigration?
Good question.
This is a good question and a timely one. So let's start with Pete.
Well, first of all, I because it's so timely, I thought, is this a political question? So let's put the politicality out of it, and let's deal with what the Bible says, obey the laws of the land. Let's start there, obey the law. And then let's go with an integral. This is a matter of integrity. So me as a born-again believer, if I'm knowingly breaking the laws of the land, in this case, it would be knowingly breaking the law, then it would be wrong for me. And he who knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is a sin. It is sin. So if you want to look at it that way, and I don't want to preach this like the old hell and brimstone preachers, sin, sin, sin. But if we look at it biblically, he who knows to do good and does it not, to him it is sin. And it is a matter of integrity.
Okay, I'm not going to let that slide without this.
Okay.
What if the law of the land is wrong? What if it says you're not allowed to convert to Christianity?
Again, that's a whole different issue.
Okay,
We have to be willing to, like Martin Luther, we have to be willing to lay our lives on the line when it comes time for that. Anything that's amoral God, then that's where we have our dividing place.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who's next?
Yeah, I agree with Pete. And I like the distinction you made, Tom. Like if I'm commanded to sin, I can't do that. I have to say I must obey God rather than man. But, the Bible talks about we are to be subject to the governing authorities, and there is a good reason to regulate and to, make sure we know who's coming into this country. We've seen people come in with nefarious purposes, and I mean, every city in Israel had walls, and it was the good kings who built up the walls. God says, your walls, O Zion, are salvation. I mean, the reason for that was because there are evil people that want to come in and do things. We have, this country was founded by immigrants. People say that all the time. It's true. But they didn't come here breaking the law. They came here and they obeyed the law, and they obeyed, other laws. Our government has so many laws, jaywalking laws, again, for order and safety, right? I mean, there's a lot of laws regulating elections and things that we might say aren't moral issues, and yet they're order issues that we need to obey. The government has the right to do that. That doesn't stop me from worshiping Christ. That doesn't stop me from obeying his commandments. And so, something like that has led to some pretty awful things, illegal drugs coming in, murderers coming in, terrorists coming in. We know that. I think this is something that Christians, when they say, well, I've got to love my neighbor, so I'm going to, break the law and let these illegals in. I think that, you're really deceiving yourself at that level, and that's really not love. Encourage them to come in the proper way.
Right.
I knew a young man whose wife had to leave because he could not get her green papers, because it takes a long time to do that. Yes. And we got all these people coming across the border, illegally and getting all this free stuff, and that's just not right. There's a process that we have in this country, and it's a just process. We ought to go through that.
Okay.
It's interesting. I had a guy ask me a question from another church that his worship leader, who was a powerful worship leader, they found out that the worship leader was in the country illegally, and asked me what they should do. And I said, wow, that was a hard one. They said, this guy loves God, that, this guy is a powerful worship leader. And this is what I told him. I said, well, why don't you get the elders of your church and, you guys go meet with the government and just let them know, what's going on, and see is there some kind of way that you can work with this guy, to help him, to be able to stay here. But I couldn't tell him, well, just let him keep on doing what he's doing, because he might not have been nefarious, but he's here illegally. So you still got to deal with the consequences of that.
And that's the purpose of coming correctly, to see who's nefarious or not. It gives us an opportunity to weed out anything. There's a due process.
Yeah.
So that's why, even in heaven, when you read about the New Jerusalem, it talks about the walls of the city. You know what I mean? And it talks about, even Jesus said, I'm the door. You come the right way, you come in. If not, you're a thief and a robber. So basically, just not being willing to go the right way exposes motive.
It says
it says something about where you are. So, I mean, people that have this issue with the fact of having the walls up and not allowing illegal immigrants in, I'm thinking in my mind, do you have a house with no doors? What if I allowed my dog, just walk my dog, and he got a chance to go, or she got a chance to go in your backyard whenever she wanted? And to leave it there. Say, well, listen, if you love me, I mean, this yard was not yours. There's a lot of dogs that used to go in this yard. Well, yeah, but I'm not going to let you go ahead and drop droppings in my yard because I'm trying, I mean, so if you look at that, just the common sense of having protection and borders. And I love the fact that even in our country, they're saying you can come in, but you can't just come in and say, I'm just going to go where I want, do what I want, however I want. That is complete ludicrous in my mind.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say, for some reason, the Lord keeps giving me scripture when you say something. but when you were talking, remember you talked about Revelation. Remember there's a verse in Revelation that talks about heaven, and it says, but the sorcerers and the dogs are outside. They're outside.
They're not allowed in.
They didn't let them in, man.
And if you ain't got no walls, you can't be outside.
Well, we're just going to stay with this for a few more minutes here, and we may not get to the other question. But so let me bring it up this way then. All right, somebody's been here 30 years, came in illegally. They're a worship leader. They're a business owner. Does this person who's obeyed the law, yes, they broke a law, they came in illegally 30 years ago, but they're here now, they've obeyed the laws, they have established everything. Should they be thrown out? Should they be thrown out, or should they be able to, is there a way to patriotize, repatriate them?
Is it living a lie? That's the question. Is it living a lie? If he's living a lie, then you remember the basketball league I used to have on Monday nights?
Yeah, I played in there.
And we had some.
I blew out my knee playing there, but yes.
The hoops, we had guys from all over playing. And I remember, and you remember the size of those guys. They were massive. Yes. And I remember after a game one time, a massive, chiseled man came up to me and said, Pastor, you won't be seeing me for a while. I murdered a guy in the Carolinas, and I got to go back and put it right. I prayed with him, and I applauded him. I said, you know what, you're an amazing human being. He said, Pastor, it was in self-defense, but I got to go put it right. And we got to be men and women enough to make sure we're putting things right.
Okay. So, I agree with that. I'm just asking, is there some level of that we can allow people to be here?
I mean, we have a process and it's legal. I would frame your question, Tom, this way. Well, if you've gotten away with a crime long enough, is it okay now that you don't have any consequences? And I think, what does that encourage by letting that happen? Hey, all you got to do is get past the 10-year period and you'll be good. Get past the 15-year period. And, I don't think we should make an exception because the guy was a Christian. If anything, we should be hard on our own kind, right? Hey, I'm sorry, you're a brother in the Lord, but you got to obey the law just like the unbelievers. I'm not going to make exceptions for believers. So I think, in something like that, that's a shame. Maybe he works out with the government. Maybe he does a little time. Maybe he pays a massive fine or something. He's still got to answer for that thing that he did that was illegal.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, no doubt. Good point. Well, it certainly is a hot button issue about a lot of different things right now. But thank you so much for the question.